King Crimson hardly need an introduction, but for the uninitiated, they're arguably the most influential progressive rock band, let alone art rock band, to have graced planet Earth. Their extensive discography not only laid the groundwork for prog rock as we commonly understand it, but facilitated some of the genre's further transformations. That said, with as many lineups, sounds, and interband spats as they've had, it's almost inevitable some of their albums are stronger in concept and execution than others. Which albums are these, and which are not as good? Hello all, Rezi here, y'all's favorite music-loving, yarn-spinning orange cat boy, and today we've got another vid, and for the first time on YouTube at least, an actual edited tier list video. Now, I did tier lists before, back when I was starting off as sort of a live streaming VTuber, and those were all well and good, but this video is essentially an update on my first ever tier list stream, this King Crimson tier list that I did 3 years ago, and, I went hard with the notes for it, like, Jesus Christ, I wrote a lot of notes on Google Drive, but ultimately, I didn't deliver it in the best way given my streaming inexperience at the time. So, for a donation incentive on my Internet Archive charity stream I had a few months back, I said I would remake one of those old streams, and y'all selected the King Crimson stream. I guess y'all were really jonesing to hear my opinion on the prog rock masterminds. So, without further ado, let's pop over here. Yeah, it's a part of my streaming rig that I don't really use so often. Don't mind the decor hanging above. Let's just pop right into it without further ado. I just have to right away give this album an S tier. I mean, what hasn't been said about this album before, including what hasn't been said about this album? It invented progressive rock, pretty much. I mean, the original lineup of King Crimson is just legendary. They were birthed out of the ashes of short-lived psych pop outfit Giles and Fripp, and evolved to be these stunning musicians in their own right. There was Greg Lake on bass and vocals, Ian McDonald on woodwinds, keys, and sax, Michael Giles on drums, who is an underrated beast of a drummer that sadly didn't do much beyond King Crimson, and then Peter Sinfield on lyrics and stage lighting. May he rest in peace. And then, of course, to round things out, Robert Fripp on guitar. And you can hear, even in the studio at this point, that their chemistry is just electrifying. 21st century schizoid man needs no introduction. I mean, it's prog proto-metal at its apex. Greg Lake's distorted vocals, screaming about the Vietnam War, Michael Giles' superb, frantic jazz fusion-inspired playing, and then Robert Fripp dueling for dominance with Ian McDonald's sax in the solo portion, in the breakdown in the middle. It's just legendary track, back to front. And then you have that followed up with the soft balladry of I Talk to the Wind, with the sweet harmonies, acoustic guitars, and a gorgeous flute part. And then Michael Giles' drumming just makes it feel like the song is floating on the breeze. Very sweet track. Then to close out side A, there's Epitaph, this powerhouse of a track. Greg Lake's dramatic vocal delivery nails Sinfield's apocalyptic lyrics, while backed with this gorgeous mournful accompaniment of mellotron, acoustic guitars, and Michael Giles' steady backbeat. And then there's, one of the more divisive tracks on the album, Moonchild. It can be confusing for first-time listeners, and believe me, I was one of them at one point. The dream portion at the beginning is this soft pastoral ballad, and then the illusion is just, it's basically free jazz. But if you listen to that part with good headphones, the sonic textures explored, even if improvisatory, even if slightly chaotic in places, they can be mind-bending, and there's a really great payoff at the end with some of the most gorgeous guitar parts Robert Fripp's ever played on record, in my opinion. And then finally, to round things out, there's The Chord of the Crimson King, which is just a perfect blend of classical sound with Ian McDonald's dancing flute melodies and Robert Fripp's iconic mellotron riff. And then there's this driving psychedelic rock undergirding it in Greg Lake and Michael Giles' rhythm section. Just a perfect summation of psychedelic rock and classical influence into, the proto-prog blueprint. And then there's the false ending, which just elevates the song to another plane entirely, where, it's kind of taking a crib of Jimi Hendrix' Axis Bold as Love, but does its own little sweet twist on it with the flute melodies coming in, followed by the dramatic drum fill, and just a grand sweeping repetition of the chorus to close things out in another key. Fantastic song, fantastic album, back to front. Why are you listening to my opinion on it? I'm just an anime catboy. Go listen to In the Court of the Crimson King again, I swear to God. Seriously, it's a legendary prog album whose innovations we kind of take for granted nowadays, but it absolutely still holds up all these years later, and it's definitely a sterling example of King Crimson's creative output, even if it was just their first record.
No use to complain if you're caught in the rain. Your mama's gone insane. Cat food, cat food, cat food again!
So, how do you follow up the most influential prog rock album of all time? Why, you implode and try it again, of course. After King Crimson's first US tour, Ian MacDonald and Michael Giles left because of artistic differences, and Greg Lake left to be the Lake in Emerson, Lake and Palmer. This left Fripp and Sinfield to essentially start over and strike while the iron was hot with In the Court of the Crimson King. The follow-up album actually features Greg Lake on vocals and Michael Giles on drums as studio musicians, along with other overdubs from some of the transitionary members of the newer King Crimson lineup, like jazz pianist Keith Tippett and future King Crimson wind player Mel Collins. The Doppelganger album that was eventually released, In the Wake of Poseidon, it's pretty good. King Crimson mostly succeeded in copying what was great about In the Court of the Crimson King. Pictures of a City is this great, dark, jazzy jam in the vein of 21st century Schizoid Man. The title track recaptures the apocalyptic grandeur of Epitaph. Cadence and Cascade is another lovely ballad in the vein of I Talk to the Wind, sung not by Lake, but Gordon Haskell. Remember that name. And The Devil's Triangle dials the sonic chaos of Moonchild up to 11. There is no In the Court of the Crimson King analog, sadly, but there is Cat Food. It's clear that this was the album's single song, and it is weird. Lake has this commanding vocal part here over these absurd Sinfield lyrics, and Keith Tippett has this piano part where he sounds like a cat walking across the keys. And it is creative and all, and I love the chemistry that they get up to in the back half. That's something that in my re-listens preparing for this tier list that I've especially been noting. But at the same time, the song just completely kills the serious pace of the album beforehand. At the same time, I can't deny, Keith Tippett, he really should have become a full-time member of King Crimson, in my opinion. There's also a recurring suite of songs throughout this album called Peace, which starts off as an a cappella vocal in a beginning, gets played as a guitar lick in a theme, and presents the full melody with guitar and vocals in an end. It's a pretty interlude, sure, but it almost kind of feels out of place with the rest of the prog rock of the album. It kind of comes as no surprise, since it's a recycling of an old Giles Fripp demo. In all, though, In the Wake of Poseidon's a good album. If you liked their debut, you'll probably like this, but since it's a bit more of the same, but just a bit less focused, I'm going to put it in B tier. Alright, next up, also released that same year, we've got Lizard, and this album is baffling. It takes more of a chamber jazz meets Ren Fair sort of approach to its sound, and in some cases it works. In other cases, boy, where do I start? See, Gordon Haskell, the guy I mentioned before, plays bass and sings on the album, and I should say right now, he's not a bad singer or bassist. See, he nailed Cadence and Cascade and sings another gorgeous pastoral King Crimson ballad on this album in Lady of the Dancing Water. But, he knew Robert Fripp from back in the days when they both played R&B together, and I think he's a really soulful singer, really good at ballads and such, but it's obvious that his heart wasn't with prog rock, and he admitted as much years after this album. He's just sort of there most of the album, and Happy Family makes it even worse by putting his vocals through like 10 different filters. The textures on this album are often too cluttered and unfocused for me to derive much joy from them. Circus is fine because of this gradual build from a soft harpsichord intro to this haunting sax-led march, but then Indoor Games and Happy Family just sort of meander, and with all the keys and woodwind overdubs, they just sort of sound more like something written by Chicago. Early Chicago, I mean, which I don't hate, but King Crimson aren't Chicago, so I generally avoid listening to these songs. The centerpiece of the album, arguably, is its 23-minute title track, which depicts both musically and lyrically the events of a battle. There are neat moments, John Anderson makes a cameo here singing on the first part of the song, and then there's the entire Battle of Glass Tears suite, which is peak. But there's also a lot of filler, like the extended bolero section, which is pretty much just a classical-inspired march played straight. This album is not necessarily bad, I definitely recommend coming around to Lizard at some point, but it can be a very alienating and exhausting listen if you go right into it after the first two, so don't sleep on it, but proceed with caution. I'm going to give Lizard a C. Gordon Haskell and drummer Andy McCulloch would depart the band acrimoniously after Lizard, leaving Fripp and Sinfield to once again pick up the pieces. They brought on two unknowns in Boz Burrell on vocals and bass and Ian Wallace on drums, and together this lineup recorded Islands, released in 1971. This album learns from the mistakes of the previous. While the band still explores unique sonic textures reminiscent of the folky, pastoral vibes from the previous album, they do so in a way which gives the listener room to breathe and the band members and studio musicians room to express themselves. Formentera Lady, for instance, goes from a duet between Boz Burrell and a double bass to a folksy section with a light, airy feeling to the layering chaos of the instruments surrounding Mel Collins' extended sax solo in the back half. The darker, heavier tracks of the album, Sailor's Tale, The Letters, and Ladies of the Road, have an intensity and chemistry which hasn't been seen in the band since their debut. A lot of striking, standout moments in these tracks, like the shift in tempo in Sailor's Tale, the freak out leading into the final verse in The Letters, Mel Collins' dirty sax solo on Ladies of the Road, just so much ugliness mixed with beauty, and it's incredible. The title track, though, is the most beautiful thing King Crimson has ever recorded. It mostly features immaculate piano work from Keith Tippett, as well as an emotional cornet solo from Mark Charig, and a heartfelt vocal from Boz Burrell singing Peter Sinfield's most Sondern lyrics ever. But the latter half, where the full band gradually comes in, though, it shows their masterful restraint, building this grand, near-symphonic background to Charig's hopeful-sounding cornet over the course of several minutes. The result is just something truly stunning. The one mark against this album is the classical composition, Prelude Song of the Gulls, and I mean classical composition. It's a quaint piece for string quartet and clarinet, and it's fine, I guess, in the context of the album and introducing the title track which comes after, but I wouldn't listen to it out of context, personally. Overall, Islands is an underrated gem. AllMusic calls it the weakest of Crimson's early period, but whoever wrote that must have been super into Lizard or on Catnip, because holy damn do I love this album. I'm giving it an A. It's not on the level of something like In the Court of the Crimson King, but it is still goddamn amazing. The Islands band did go on tour and promote the album, but Fripp pissed off his bandmates with his control freak nature, and they pissed him off with their rock and roll lifestyle. He also dismissed Sinfield at this time. Though the band ended their tour on good terms, Fripp decided to create an entirely new Crimson lineup afterwards, based on free improvisation and Eastern European classical music. This included bassist/vocalist John Wetton, percussionist and wild man Jimmy Muir, violinist David Cross, and former Yes drummer Bill Bruford, one of my personal favorite drummers of all time. After a few months of touring, they put out Larks, Tongues, and Aspic. And in hindsight, this was a hell of a stylistic jump. It continued the Crimson tradition of fusing all sorts of different sonic textures, but these textures increasingly trended towards the more abrasive. Think more 21st century Schizoid Man and less In the Court of the Crimson King. It is here where we see the beginnings of progressive metal, born from the intensity of this band's studio and live jams, or blows as Fripp called them. Half of this album's tracks, and more than half of its runtime, is devoted to such jamming. The talking drum, though basically just an extended bongo-driven jam, is an exercise in tension, the five-man band building from a quiet stampede rumble to a roaring charge until it's broken by a shrill horn noise. Then there are Larks, Tongues, and Aspic, Part 1 and Part 2. The first part is a 13-minute epic with multiple different sections, from a peaceful, quasi-Southeast Asian percussion melody to the band's full entry harkened by Robert Fripp's crushing guitar tone, to an extended violin cadenza by Cross, all connected by this driving motivic riff Fripp plays throughout the song. The second is more compact and heavier, building on the motivic riff from the first part with a badass mid-tempo groove supplied by the rhythm section. It's like a heavy metal version of Igor Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. Despite the instrumental focus of this album, there are actually 3 songs sung by John Wetton. By far the best is the ballad Exiles, which brings back the mellotron from early King Crimson albums and pairs its chords beautifully with a violin melody by David Cross, and also alternates between the sweet sections and the menacing sounds of reversed, distorted electric guitar. The Book of Saturday is a neat little ballad too, but at just under 3 minutes it doesn't last long enough to leave a lasting impression. Easy Money, on the other hand, is the cheekiest song about seduction written by a prog rock band this side of Young Lust. The groove in this song is so chill, and the vocals, guitar, and drums seem to dance with each other during the verses, only to join together for the heavy chorus drop. This is where the 2 drummers shine the most, in my opinion, as Bill Bruford lays down a steady backbeat while Jamie Muir is using his percussion and all sorts, as he called them, including a laughing kid's toy, to create all sorts of strange layers. Overall, Larks, Tongues, and Aspic is a stellar first outing for this incarnation of King Crimson, if a little undercooked in some areas. Still, though, I am giving this record an A.
10% is now a joke. Maybe 30, even 35. I say my daddy's had his stroke. Half an hour with me only was alive.
After Larks, it seemed as though King Crimson were hitting a new stride. And then Muir just left to become a monk. The remaining 4 carried on as a quartet, heavily touring from 1973 into 1974. There are some stellar performances from this time, blending King Crimson songs with interspersed blows, and I definitely recommend checking out some of the live albums they've put out. That said, this heavy touring left the band with little new material for a follow-up album. So what did they do? They took soundboard recordings of improv from the tour, added to and polished them with new recordings in the studio, called them new songs, and put them in a package whose name would later inspire an airgay, Starless and Bible Black. Easy as pie. Well, not so much. See, 2 of the songs for the album were actually recorded entirely in the studio, but the vast majority are pulled from their live shows. Those 2 studio songs, The Great Deceiver and Lament, are excellent showcases of the band's song-making chops, especially the former. The former might be a little jarring for first-time listeners. You see, the first line of the song literally drops a homophobic slur. And yes, I know that's not how it was intended, but the lyricist later regretted his word choice. Lament is also a great song hitting at greed in the recording industry, a chip Robert Fripp has always had on his shoulder, and it goes through a lot of wild tonal shifts in its tight 4 minutes. And then we get into the improvised material, and, well, it's hit and miss. On the one hand, pieces like Trio and The Night Watch showcase the band as pros of chordal and melodic organization, especially Trio, which is such a sweet guitar, bass, and violin moment captured live that Bruford was given songwriting credits for the song for just not playing. The rest meanders, and while there are some genuinely cool jam band moments on the title track, it takes a few minutes, of a 9-minute song, mind you, to really get there. Fracture, however, deserves special mention. It's not quite improvised, even if it is recorded live, as you can clearly hear the song develop into multiple related sections based on Robert Fripp's dissonant guitar riffs. It's a damn powerhouse of a piece. From a soft section with Fripp quickly playing his guitar like a banjo over a tense groove and eerie violin playing, to the recurring heavy riff reminiscent of Black Sabbath, to the end part where Fripp and Cross are continually going up in pitch while Wetton and Bruford chase after them frantically. Definitely the instrumental highlight of the album. Overall, I'd put Starless and Bible Black in C tier. It's not a bad album per se, the band was firing on all cylinders at this point, but it can be a challenging listen if you're not used to improvisational music. The albums bookending it are both more cohesive by comparison, in my opinion, but definitely do check it out if you're a fan of this lineup of King Crimson. After Starless and Bible Black, the Crimson Quartet toured for a bit longer before things started to come apart. By summer of 1974, Cross was kicked out of the group because of musical differences. Really, it was becoming increasingly hard for his electric violin to be heard over the power of Bruford and Wetton's rhythm section, what Fripp has called a flying brick wall. Fripp himself was having his own doubts about King Crimson and the music industry in general, withdrawing into mysticism. Under these circumstances, the remaining trio of Bruford, Fripp, and Wetton would get together to record what would then be King Crimson's final album, though they didn't then know it. However, a trio album this ain't. The resulting album, Red, would actually feature the most amount of additional studio musicians since Islands, including former King Crimson members Mel Collins and Ian MacDonald. So, what of its music? Well, Red is actually the heaviest album King Crimson had released to date, taking full advantage of the flying brick wall to deliver a crushing, claustrophobic sound that's as captivating as it is abrasive. Its sound would have a tremendous reaching influence, influencing musicians of all stripes from prog metal bands to Kurt Cobain of Nirvana. What helps it along even more is that it doesn't meander, structured similarly to In the Court of the Crimson King with 5 songs in total, 4 of which are actual songs constructed in the studio. Even the track Providence, which is another live improv recorded before Cross left, fits in well with the tone of the album, beginning with a frightening conversation between violin and bass and developing into a heavy jam between the flying brick wall and Fripp's guitar feedback. As for the songs themselves, they're some of the best King Crimson has ever written. Red is a menacing instrumental built around a series of dissonant guitar riffs, with the rhythm section tagging along at a sludgy pace. It's killer while not losing the complexity of before. It's probably the King Crimson song you're most likely to headbang to, actually. Fallen Angel is this haunting ballad about gang violence in New York City. I love how it alternates between these menacing bits like the opening low guitar swell and the arpeggiated riff sections with Mark Cherrig returning on cornet, and beautiful moments like the sweet acoustic verses and an oboe melody in the final verse. It's a perfect balance of heavy Crimson and their more tender moments from earlier albums, and all in a compact 6 minutes, which is the shortest runtime on the album, believe it or not. One More Red Nightmare is a song about having a nightmare about a plane crash, and it rules. Bill Bruford's drumming and use of broken cymbals, combined with the discordant riffs of Wetton and Fripp, really sell the atmosphere of being trapped in a falling aircraft. In the solo sections, Ian MacDonald takes 2 sax solos and they're immaculate, especially the second where he's fighting to be heard over Bruford's drum fills. The highlight of the album, and arguably the best song King Crimson's ever recorded, is Starless. It starts as this lovely ballad featuring a lyrical guitar melody from Fripp before transitioning into an unsettling middle section which continually builds into a nightmarish cacophony of drum fills, thundering bass, and hair-raising repeated guitar notes before suddenly, wham! The song bursts into new life with sax solos from McDonald and Mel Collins as the flying brick wall races to the finish, repeating melodies from the ballad section on the way to bring the song full circle. An absolute masterclass of a song. I can't give Red anything other than S tier. It's my favorite King Crimson album, and it's still inspiring 50 years on. So, as I mentioned, after Red, King Crimson broke up essentially, and Fripp was in the proverbial wilderness, exploring his spirituality and collabing with art rockers like Brian Eno, David Bowie, Peter Gabriel, and Talking Heads. And he also had a solo career and played with this band called League of Gentlemen and produced artists like Daryl Hall. Anyways, he eventually formed a new band with Bruford in 1980 and brought on board guitarist Adrian Belew and bassist Tony Levin. This band toured for a bit as Discipline before Fripp decided that they were going to be a new incarnation of King Crimson. And so this group's first album, Discipline, presents a new King Crimson sound, reconfigured for the 1980s, where prog rock had declined, let's say, as all other bands veered commercial. This new King Crimson sound is midway between prog rock and the new wave music of the late 70s and early 80s. Adrian Belew actually played with the Talking Heads on their Remain in Light tour, and their influences felt both in his rhythmic guitar work and David Byrne-esque voice. Belew was the second guitarist in the band. See, Fripp wanted to try what he called a rock gamelan with interlocking guitar parts, and this is displayed spectacularly several times on the album, such as Frame by Frame and the delicately bounced title track instrumental. As you might guess from the above, there's more of a world music influence on this album, most notably in the serene instrumental The Sheltering Sky, which sounds like a peaceful day at the beach, and Thela Hung Jinjit with its pounding tom-heavy beat. With Tony Levin in the band, King Crimson actually incorporated another instrument, the Chapman stick, into their sound. It's an interesting instrument, essentially a tap bass, and it's deployed especially well on the funky intro track Elephant Talk. Just to gush a bit more about Adrian Belew for a second, he was King Crimson's most charismatic frontman, an inventive lyricist, and possibly the only other guitarist who could rival Fripp in terms of weird guitar experimentation. There's this one live recording he did. He was in David Bowie's live band back in the late 70s, and this one live recording of him playing station to station and replicating train noises and going ape shit on the feedback just completely wrote my conception of what a good lead guitarist could be when I was a student in college. Oh my god. But he has plenty of moments like that throughout Discipline. He mimics the sounds of an elephant on Elephant Talk, he mimics seagulls on Mate Kudasai, and he sells the bizarre lyrics of Elephant Talk in Indiscipline with his frantic speak-singing delivery, which is just intoxicating. And speaking of Indiscipline, that's the album's highlight, with Fripp and Belew trading noisy guitar solos in between these quiet, tense narration sections, and Bruford going absolutely ham on the drum kit. Discipline has a lot to love and was a great start for this incarnation of King Crimson, but compared to other stellar King Crimson albums, it's missing more textures. For as much as the band can do with two guitars, there's essentially just one sound on this album. But damn is it a sound. I would give Discipline an A. So the new band was a success and hit the road touring. When King Crimson started planning for another album, though, they found themselves in a pickle. They hadn't developed much in the way of new material. In fact, Belew was finding it hard to write for songs with the rock gamelan in mind. So the band entered the studio, wrote, bickered with each other, and nearly broke up, and we got Beat out of it. Oh boy, this album. Just to get it out of the way, this isn't a bad album, but it's more so a bad King Crimson album. While the interlocking guitar parts and worldly influences of Discipline still show up and are on point, the balance between new wave and prog rock has tipped towards the former such that most of the album feels indistinguishable from other new wave acts of the time. Talking Heads, of course, come to mind. This album is heavily inspired also by beat culture of the 50s, so you have titles like Neil and Jack and Me, Sartori and Tangier, and Heartbeat. But the influence doesn't extend much further than lyrical references and titles. Much of the material is King Crimson playing it safe. Heartbeat and Two Hands are obvious examples of this, but a lot of the other songs in the album lack that drive and edge that made Discipline so compelling, even if there are some pretty neat textures being laid down between guitar, bass, and Chapman stick. Neurotica is a highlight, with Baloo spouting off a rapid-fire radio narration over top a driving jazz fusion instrumental. It's the piece with the most connection to Crimson's previous trailblazing, with plenty of crazy time signature manipulations, dissonant guitar notes, and yet more insane drumming from Bill Bruford. The ending track Requiem is also neat. Baloo and Bruford improvise from a murmur to a pained roar over top a dark atmospheric tape loop created by Fripp. It's a harsh listen, and it actually led to the near breakup of the band, but compared with the other tracks on the album, it is a serious attempt to break the limitations of their new sound. Unfortunately, it's too little, too late. Overall, Beat gets a D. It's not bad music, like I said, but if I want to recommend a King Crimson album to someone, Beat would be far from the top just because King Crimson are capable of so much more, in my opinion. After Beat, King Crimson embarked on another live tour before again trying to recapture what made Discipline work in the studio. The process of writing the next album was apparently difficult and strained, and there's a whole compilation album out there of the band's work-in-progress ideas, but what we eventually got was something of a compromise in Three of a Perfect Pair. The compromise? Side A consisted of more commercial, easy-to-listen-to songs, while Side B consisted of more experimental, mostly instrumental pieces. Accessible and excessive, respectfully, as Fripp said at the time. Perfectly balanced, as all things should be. So, how does this balance play out in practice? Well, it's actually pretty decent. The commercial tracks in Side A are some of the best Baloo has written, wonderfully fusing the interlocking guitars and weird time signatures of Discipline with the pop sensibility found on Beat. The title track especially is a wonderful track. Those harmonies. But I also like Man with an Open Heart and Model Man and the way they played with weird time signatures while still sounding catchy as hell. Also Sleepless, the bass, that bass, and drums are funky as hell, but the guitars, synths, and Baloo's lyrics contribute a bit of creepy, haunted atmosphere to it. Side B is a more cerebral listen. The ominous Industry sounds like a precursor to the atmospheric video game music of the 90s. Dig Me is a bizarre track with more quirky, speak-singy vocals from Baloo a la Neurotica, and the closing track is a continuation of the Larks, Tongues, and Aspic suite. Part 3 is great in its own right, but as with all trilogies, it kinda pales in comparison to the first two. The first half brilliantly updates the melody from the first two parts at a faster, more frantic pace, before slowing down into an extended track for the rest of the song, which goes on a bit too long in my opinion. If there was more of that first part, I'd love the third Larks, Tongues, and Aspic a lot more. In all, though, Three of a Perfect Pair is definitely a better album than Beat, but there are still some moments that drag it down. No Warning and Nuages, in particular on Side B, they're decent atmospheric tracks, but not much notable beyond that. I feel comfortable placing Three of a Perfect Pair in B tier. So at this point, Fripp was fed up again with the band and dissolved it. Over the next decade, he would focus on teaching students his unique way of playing through a set of courses called Guitar Craft, and forming his own label, Discipline Global Mobile, to break away from the music industry. Meanwhile, Levin continued his work with Peter Gabriel, Ballou continued his solo career and toured with David Bowie again, and Bill Bruford temporarily rejoined Yes, a hilarious sequence of events for another video. Eventually, with Digital Global Mobile now Fripp's musical playground, he decided to reform King Crimson in 1994, with the 80s lineup making a return, in addition to new members drummer Pat Mastelotto of Mr. Mister and Warr guitarist and Fripp pupil Trey Gunn. The Warr guitar is basically like an extended sort of tap guitar, kind of like the Chapman stick. It's very heavy, it can get very low tones, essentially. So this new King Crimson group would henceforth tour and record under this double trio arrangement for the next few years. And if you listen to a live concert from this time, you can definitely get an idea for the mammoth sound they could create. So what to make of their only studio album then, 1995's THRAK? Well, to first talk about its sound, I feel like the band was responding to the environment around them as they returned to the heavy crunch of the free improv King Crimson, in response to prog metal's growing popularity, no doubt, while still keeping a foot in the interwoven guitars of the 1980s incarnation. This sound is something to behold, especially when Mastelotto and Bruford are playing off of each other. The songs Dinosaur, People, and Sex, Sleep, Eat, Drink, Dream are particularly striking in this regard. Ballou is still just as good a singer as ever, meanwhile, howling his guts out on these tracks. There are even nice softer moments on the album, like the two Inner Garden interlude tracks and Walking on Air, which for my money is the most beautiful ballad Ballou has written. One Time is also a decent soft track, though I think that the double trio is kinda underutilized on it. That said, I just mentioned all the vocal tracks on the album. The rest consists of instrumentals with largely onomatopoeic names like Baboom and Vroom, and they're fine, but largely unmemorable in my opinion. It comes off to me as retread ground from Red. Hell, one of the instrumentals apparently even used the guitar part originally written for Red. And to make matters worse, this was put out when CDs were all the rage and bands packed them full of songs regardless of if the album was well-paced or not. And I feel like this album kind of suffers from that a little. It goes on for almost an hour, and with these instrumentals it kind of has little new to say, even if they are pretty decent, passing through on a listen. Overall, I would say THRAK is a decent album, but one that I've not really bothered with since my last re-listen. I actually listened to this for the first time since, my last tier ranking stream 3 years ago. And I still think it's a C tier, I'm sorry. Good cuts, but it gets bogged down by its instrumental padding. After the double trio's massive tour, there was a period where the band didn't know where to go. Rehearsals were fruitless, so the band instead splintered into various groups called projects, exploring jazz and other improvisational music for inspiration. During this time, Bruford and Levin left to focus on other projects, leaving the double trio a double duo. The remaining four eventually hunkered down in Ballou's personal studio to record a new album, and, well, they should have been workshopping ideas a bit longer, I think. What we got out of this was Construktion of Light, spelled with a K, cause King Crimson, get it? Get it? Get it? Which, in my opinion, is King Crimson's worst album. I should start with the positives. The title track is decent, and the vocal section calls to mind Discipline era Crimson. It shows the rock gamelan in Hocket for the first time, which is a neat textural change. The lead guitar melody essentially ping-pongs between Fripp and Blue one note at a time, which is especially cool when they're doing like 16th note runs. Fractured is a modern reimagining of Fracture, making the implicit prog metal overtones of the original even more explicit to thrilling results. I also like the coda for Larks, Tongues, and Aspic Part 4, I Have a Dream, where Baloo lists off 20th century atrocities while the drums and guitars collapse all around him. But holy hell, this album just sounds ugly overall. Mastelotto's drums tracks are partly acoustic, partly electric, but wholly sound like garbage compared to his work on THRAK. There are little interesting sonic experimentations on this album, but most are more so annoying. Prozac Blues, the opening track of the album, mind you, is especially heinous, distorting and ruining Baloo's voice to make him sound like a blues singer, while the rest of the band plays a janky backing track. As soon as this song comes on, I get an instant stink face. Like, I tried to re-listen to this album, I tried to see something good out of it, right? But, you know, when this, as soon, the instant this song came on, instant stink face. Oh my god. Other vocal tracks don't fare much better. Into the Frying Pan is a confusing mess of a song which lacks the catchiness that the vocal tracks on THRAK did, and The World's My Oyster, Soup, Kitchen, Floor, Wax Museum has an interesting groove, but at 6 minutes, it wears out its welcome quickly. The largest disappointment, though, is Larks, Tongues, and Aspic Part 4. It's 13 minutes long like the first, but unlike that track, this one has barely any tonal or dynamic shifts to catch your attention, and is just heavy riff after heavy riff after heavy riff until the coda. In fact, that's something to say about this album in general. It lacks a lot of the sonic textural experimentation past King Crimson albums reveled in. It starts weird and heavy, and it ends weird and heavy, with one exception. The final track, Heaven and Earth, is a nice instrumental blending ambient synth patterns with a driving rock section before ending on the calming tides of the synths and deep drums. If I'm being honest, it's probably the most King Crimson song on the album, and it's technically not even King Crimson, it's Project X! All in all, Construktion of Light sucks. It's King Crimson on autopilot, which is not a phrase King Crimson should ever be associated with. This is a definite D. So after releasing that specimen of an album, King Crimson once again went on tour, notably supporting Tool on their Lateralis tour. Imagine that. The masters of prog rock and prog metal opening for their modern torchbearers. Over the next few years of crimsonizing, as Fripp would put it, the double duo grew more comfortable with one another and began coming into a new sound which they teased in a few EPs. Finally, the fruits of their efforts came out in The Power to Believe in 2003, their final studio effort to date, and likely their final studio effort, period, given the band are now permanently broken up. Though still a long album, it is mercifully a few minutes shorter than the preceding two. But actually, though, this album has a much better flow than either. The band brings back the idea of the recurring sweet song as a through line from In the Wake of Poseidon in the form of The Power to Believe, a series of 4 tracks interspersed through the album, and, with the exception of the first, they are songs with their own distinct sections and sonic experimentations, though 2 does go on a bit too long. The instrumentals here are an improvement from Construktion, in the first place because Mastelotto is playing a great sounding acoustic kit this time, and also because they're more dynamic and experimental in their textures. This album notably incorporates a lot of industrial beats and samples, which works in some cases, particularly level 5 and electric, instrumentals so heavy and clean you'd think they were pulled off a factory assembly line. In other instances, like the record scratches on Happy with What You Have to Be Happy With, it comes off as a bit corny and dated.
and it's routine to be as good as any other place. So sing until I'm blue in the face.
Speaking of happy with what you have to be happy with, the vocal songs in this album are a marginal improvement from the last. The haunting track Eyes Wide Open is a personal highlight of mine, and Facts of Life is a straight banger. Happy, though, is a bit too goofy of a song for me, in part because of the record scratches and also because of Baloo's meta lyrics about writing the song itself. The Power to Believe is overall fine and shows the double duo in a more comfy position than before, but it's still a bit of an exhausting listen due to its length and complexity. I would say if you want to get into King Crimson, make your way to this album eventually, but don't start off with it. It's a great latter-day album though, so I'm gonna give it a B. And that is it for the tier list. After this, of course, King Crimson still had quite a bit of history as a live act, including this stunning 3-drummer lineup they toured with from 2014 to 2021 called, at various points, the Seven-Headed Beast, or 3/5, depending on how many people they had in their entourage at the time. Not only did Fripp involve people from the earlier years like Mel Collins, Tony Levin, and Pat Mastelotto, but notable drummers like Gavin Harrison, Jeremy Stacy, and Bill Rieflin, who sadly died during his tenure, RIP, and new second guitarist Jacko Jaksic, whose life is an entire-ass musical rabbit hole that we don't have time to get into this late into the video. Basically, the man's life for the past 10 years before he joined Crimson was an extended audition for the band. I got to see this lineup twice in the mid-2010s and was blown away both times, hopeful that they'd eventually translate all their triple drumming dynamism into a studio album, but no dice. Ah well, Fripp does what Fripp wants, and if that's goofing around with his wife on YouTube at this point, all the more power to him. King Crimson have done more than enough to revolutionize music over the past few decades, and so they've more than earned their rest. But with that, we're all done here. What'd you think? What are your favorite and least favorite King Crimson albums? Would you like to hear me talk about King Crimson's live output at some point? Let me know down in the comments below, and be sure to like the video for the algorithm, and possibly subscribe if you're interested in following me for more music-related deep dives and reviews. And if you want to support me financially, I've got a Patreon with exclusive content on it, as well as a Ko-fi for one-off donations. I hope to bring y'all more news soon about my plans for next year, including the continuation of my glam metal deep dive series and hopefully other lighter content like this that I can post between the heavier projects. But until then, I'll see y'all next time. Bye-bye!